Hey, well, welcome everybody. I am Professor Michael Beck, and my partner in missional mischief in this course will be Rosario Picardo. And we're so grateful to have you in the class. And this is the opening lecture. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here of ER655, Ministry in a Digital Age. So if you are in that class, you're in the right course. We'll be doing the lectures online, the discussions throughout the week that you have, the assignments, and then we'll make some opportunities to be together as well and have some conversations, digitally enabled, obviously. So this first lecture is really about defining the digital age, defining the digital age. And I'm going to move kind of quickly because there's a lot of groundwork to kind of lay here, but some key terms that we're going to use throughout the semester to cultivate is to prepare and use a space to grow a crop. We're going to use that language, that organic language around cultivation in the digital ecosystem. So when you cultivate something, you grow something, you nurture it, something that has life and exists, and you kind of help it to grow, if you will. When I use the language of digital, what I'm thinking about is electronic technology that includes an interaction of an online nature and analog, these two words that really just came into popular use right during COVID. But analog describes on-site spatial reality. So notice that it does not mean that digital is not embodied. It does not mean that digital is not real. It does not mean that digital is not in person. Okay, we got to change that language. That's one of the things we're going to kind of push against as we go through this. You are an embodied person when you're online and you're using your senses and your fingers and parts of your brain and your body. So you don't cease to be an online a person when you're in an online relational engagement. So we'll kind of look at that as we go along. Fresh expressions is I'm going to talk about that some. Is a form of church for our changing culture that's established primarily for the benefit of those who aren't part of any church. So it's church with people that don't go to church, nuns, duns, de-church, no church, and we'll dig into that reality as we go across the semester. And we'll dig into this idea of the blended ecology, which includes traditional on-site forms of church existing in an ecology with online and fresh emerging missional forms of church living all together in an ecosystem. Now, when we say the digital age, what we mean by that is this is simply the time period starting in the 1970s when the personal computer became widely available. Then in the 80s and 90s, remember we had the internet facilitated the dramatic proliferation of digital devices. So now we've got these personal computers. Now they're connected across space and time. In the 2010s, the smartphone revolution came. It's essentially placed a supercomputer into the pocket of billions of human beings, creating a new social web and a hyper-connected mobile technology. One of the books that you're going to read, Fresh Expressions in a Digital Age, is going to talk about the telegraph, and one of the first distance contact scenarios where information was sent at the speed of light, right, across a line through the telegraph. And so people could communicate across great distances at tremendous speed. So that's called distance contact, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go throughout the semester. But one of the big ideas that we want to kind of entertain together that is in this digital age, any follower of Jesus with internet access and a device can be a missionary in the digital age. You don't have to have a theology degree. You don't have to have credentialing. You don't have to do that. If you got a device and a way to get on the internet, you can be a missionary in this digital age. And so there's both an incredible opportunity in that, right? Because now we can reach people all over the world like never before. There's also a danger of this new reality. So those same technologies that we use to communicate and form relationships can wire us for addiction. They can change the pathways of our brain. We're going to dig into that a little bit. And they can disconnect us from our place. And they can, in some ways, we can be totally hyper-connected, but completely isolated And so we're going to explore some of those dangers. And an attention economy, there are these third-party corporations that are monetizing our attention economy to stay on our screens. And so as missionaries in the digital age, we have to be conscious of that. So a quick little kind of assessing our context snapshot. We believe that the first task of a leader is to paint an accurate picture of reality. So to minister in a digital age, we need to understand the digital age. We need to understand where we are in the midst of it and kind of paint a picture of that, to put a pin in the map with the people that we serve and be able to say, where are we? Where have we been? And where are we going? And to try to get a snapshot. So just to quickly look over this crowd, I encourage you to see how many phones can you count in this crowd. So in 2005, the Pope's getting ready to come out to bring the inaugural address. Folks have gathered. Look out over the crowd. I see one person there with the flip phone. How many phones can you count in the crowd there? Now let's jump forward just 8 years to 2013, same situation, people waiting for the Pope to come out. Now, how many devices can you count? Right? So think in just the space of 8 years, the proliferation of digital devices, the continued kind of upgrading and refining of technology and digitality and connection. And so that's a rapid change that we've experienced just in that 8-year period, right? And now here we are on the other side of that, almost a decade beyond that. And now we've got virtual reality and hyper connected and digital devices all over the place. So we're going to explore some of those things. But this little device right here, this smartphone, is literally a supercomputer that we have in our pockets, right? That some of the technologies in our smartphones are, you can be a Android person too, that's fine. I'm an Apple person, but there's more technology in our cell phones than some of the first satellites that were sent up into space, right? And we hold that in the palm of our hand. Information, so we call it the information age, and information is the oil of the information age. But information is hyper accessible. Now, misinformation, that's a whole other thing we got to explore, right? But this is a very powerful device that we have in our hands at all times. So one reality we need to contend with is the church has not really been aware and adapted to the societal change and the digital revolution and all the things that have happened around us. And so here's a question to ask ourselves. Have we been perfectly prepared for a world that no longer exists? Have we been perfectly trained for a world that's not here anymore? And in this course, we want to make sure that that's not the case, that we do get prepared for the world that we actually live in. One way to think about this is the difference between kind and wicked learning environment. So a kind learning environment is an environment where there's like rules of the game. It's golf, it's chess. You move a piece here, you move your pawn here. There's a way that things work. There's a method. You get feedback, deliberative practice, repetitive experience. You master the game, right? Same thing with golf. A wicked learning environment, not wicked in the sense of bad, but wicked in the sense of complex and different, right? May not include the repetitive patterns, the rules of the game are changing, unclear status quo. And so this is like playing alien tennis, right? That we're in a whole new environment, and the skills that you need in a wicked environment are to apply knowledge from other pursuits creatively, adaptation, outside experience, those kind of things for mastery. So if we live like we're still in a kind learning environment when we're actually in a wicked learning environment, we're not going to be very effective in ministry, right? And one way to think about this is there's been a change of ecosystems. That we kind of lived and grew up in a jungle. We know how to manage that ecosystem. We know how to live in a jungle, but now we find ourselves as Christians in a desert. A desert is an ecosystem. There's life forms, but now we got to figure out how to exist in this desert. And that's not a technical problem and a technical solution. Like we'll just do better worship or better preaching or better whatever, coffee, and we'll figure it out. This is an adaptive challenge. We have to learn how to live in this new space. We got to find the oases of the spirit We got to figure out how to get water out of a cactus. And sometimes we're going to get splinters in our hands as we do that. So this is a different kind of ecosystem where we find ourselves. One way to think about this reality is Alan Hirsch talks about the 60-40 problem. And in the corporate world, corporations fight in the blood red waters of the 40% of an already existing customer base, and usually neglect the big blue ocean, the 60% of the possible customer base that can only be reached through innovation and entrepreneurship. So in the Christian world, we fight in the blood red waters for that already existing group of Christians, right? And some churches grow from Christians playing church musical chairs. So we'll go to this church because they got the better preaching, the better sermons, the better whatever. And we'll, where people are shuffling around playing church musical chairs. But how do we be church with the big blue ocean, the 60% who are never going to walk in our church? And in some contexts, like in my two churches that I serve, it's larger than 60% that are never going to walk into our church, no matter how good we do our worship or how great our buildings are or our coffee is. So how do we reach that blue ocean? One part of how we answer that question is going to have to be how we address the challenges of ministry in a digital age and how we go about ministry in the digital age. There's a decline in affiliation. We know this stuff, right? Less and less people affiliate or belong or become members of organizations. At the same time, there's an uptick and a rise in spirituality, spiritual but not religious, people open to spiritual paths, but pushing against institutional religion, the hierarchical church, and the different kinds of church that most of us kind of grew up with. So friends, this is a paradigm shifter, right? David Bosch was one of the missiologists. If you've never read Transforming Mission, I think that anybody who's a Jesus follower in the 21st century has to read that book. But David Bosch talks about, he takes up this language of paradigm shifts, which actually originated with Thomas Kuhn, a philosopher. But Bosch, working off of his work, says that, decades, sometimes even centuries, this kind of change can happen. But a new paradigm is still emerging. And for the most part, at the moment, we're thinking and working in two paradigms. And this, friends, is the case where we find ourselves today. So we talk about post everything, right? Post Christendom, post industrial age, post truth, post whatever, right? And so what we're doing is we're defining ourselves by saying this used to be the thing, but we're no longer that. So we're in this post situation, but we're really in between what used to be and what's coming. And we're kind of living in those two paradigms right now. And that is what we call a liminality. So this is borrowing from the language of Victor Turner in the ritual process. He talks about that as you go through that ritual process, there's the pre-ritual, the post-ritual, but in between is the liminia, the Latin word for the threshold, the liminality. There's a transitionary process in between that, right? So we're not what we used to be. We're transforming into something else, but we're kind of in between that, the in-betweenness, the stage in the middle of change, to state it simply, liminality. And right now we're in a liminal age, right? So we're moving out of the industrial age, but that's part of the remnants are still there. We're moving into this digital age. We're not fully in that, right? And we're kind of in between, generationally speaking. Leonard Sweet and I wrote a little book called Contextual Intelligence, and this was my doctoral research was in this area. But what we stated in that book is COVID-19 was the first global black swan. A black swan event is something that comes out of nowhere. It's unexpected, right? And that virus, it still to this day, as I'm speaking now, we've got the Omicron surge going on. Changed the face of the future in the world, in the church. One crisis virus did to clericalism and pastoral, ministry and life, what 2,000 years of Reformation could not. One global lockdown thrust us, right, into this digital age, and we all had to figure out how to install an internet front door and start streaming our worship services. Many people were already doing that before the pandemic, okay? But lots of us churches, we maybe weren't doing it well, or we weren't maybe doing it as our primary way of thinking about being the church, right? And so we were thrust into this area. Decades and decades of books and lectures and seminars failed to do that. The virus kind of did it very quickly. So one way to think about this is we kind of lived and grew up in a Mr. Rogers neighborhood world that defines itself by place and zip code and neighborly good. And it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And my neighbor, I know them well, and I know their names and their family, and maybe I borrow sugar or my neighbor's lawnmower, right? Well, we're no longer in the neighborhood society. We're now in the network society. And think of Neo's Matrix, right? And so those films were kind of prophetic in the sense of saying there's like these two worlds, the physical on-site world, if you will, and the online world, you know, and take the red pill or the blue pill and kind of decide your reality. So if you think about it, we kind of live in these two worlds, right? There's the world that we access to our screens and our digital technology and distance contact at the speed of light. And then there's that physical on-site world where we move through physically built spaces and have relationships in that way. And we're kind of living in both of those. Manuel Castells was a sociologist, really a prophetic sociologist. And he was the first that started to use this language around the network society. And this is a social structure made up of networks powered by microelectronic based information and communication technologies. And he believed that space throughout human history, that you could define it, and quoting him, and this is his book, The Network Society, the material support of simultaneity and social practice. So the material support of simultaneity in social practice. So as we come into a space, there's material support that's facilitating our relationships and our social practices. But there's this other kind of space that Manuel starts to talk about, the space of flows and the space of place. So in a network society, flows are the means through which people, objects, information are moved through social space. So there's these multiple layers of networks, digital and analog, and they intertwine and they connect people in nodes and hubs. So when you think about a network, think about like a circuit board. There's little nodes, there's little connection points, there's little hubs with gatherings of nodes. Now think about your neighborhood. There's online access points, there's physical access points. So there's places that we gather in the space of place, and there's online spaces where we gather in the space of flows. And these flows kind of connect all of these things. And people in a neighborhood society, it might be about literally your neighborhood. In a network society, we have to think of the first, second, and third places. This is language created by Ray Oldenburg, another sociologist who wrote a book called The Great Good Place. So the first place is your home space. Second place is your school or your workspace. Third place are those neutral places where we gather for communion, restaurants, bars, dog parks, yoga studios, wherever that's in your community, community centers. And those are the kind of places where people gather around practices. So in the digital age, we have to recognize the difference between these two kinds of space, the space of place and the space of flows. And the space of place is that space of contiguity, that direct contact, right? So when we're gathered in a space of place, it's direct contact on site. Now, I know there's been a lot of recent scholarship that's come out. It's interesting that usually the people that write about these things are not practitioners in ministry. They're just kind of theorists that are thinking through these things and really dismissing the whole online space and dismissing that community and relationship can form in an online ecosystem. And really, that is a missional cul-de-sac, friends, that we really have to understand that online is creating a different kind of space, and community and relationships and things can form in that online space. In fact, they have been forming in the online space for decades. Take, for example, the disabilities community. Some persons in the disabilities community who are differently abled, their only form of contact and work and community is facilitated through online, right? And so they might not be mobile. They might not be able to have many of the things that we take for granted, right? And so online community facilitates a way for them to work and to play and to have relationships. And those are the real pioneers in the digital ecosystem, by the way, who've been living and forming community in those spaces. So through the amalgamation of these technologies, along with computer and computerized transportation, this simultaneity was introduced in social relations at a distance. So distance contact, remember the telegraph, speeding light at the speed of light, contact, right? In that first message, what hath God wrought? That's in the book, so y'all check it out. But meaning that humans no longer have to interact in a face-to-face way to have contact. So we're sending messages at the speed of light to each other and communicating across great distances. So that changes the way that human beings can interact and have contact and have relationship and fall in love and everything else. And so the transformation of this spatiality of social interaction through simultaneity at a distance creates this new kind of space, the space of flows, right? So that when we're in a Zoom meeting or we're in a Facebook live group or we're in a virtual reality, and our church, we have all those things. We have a church in a Facebook group, a community called the Living Room Church. We have church in a virtual reality. We get on our headsets Monday nights at 8 p.m. and we have church in VR and alt space, Living Room Church VR, right? And so these are spaces where people are gathering for communion, in our case, Christian worship and teaching. So Castells defines the space of place flows as the material support of simultaneous social practices communicated at a distance. So we're in relationship and contact, and we're gathered just like you would gather in a physical space, but we're gathered online. I'll unpack that a little bit more. So there's a built environment, a city, a town, and that built environment facilitates interaction. So we're walking down the street, we see our friend, we stop and say hi, we go to the coffee shop, we connect with somebody. So our built environment is facilitating our relationships and our interactions. Now, if you think about a computer, there's the chipboard, right? And the wires and the chips and the digital pulses that flow through all that. The web is another kind of built environment. So when we're in a Zoom room, we're in a built environment. When we're in a Facebook group, we're in a built environment, but it's a digitally mediated and built environment of distance contact. So just like cities have buildings and they facilitate a kind of contact, think of these chips and wires and satellites and screens and technology devices and VR headsets. They facilitate another kind of contact, this distance contact. Still relationship, still interaction, still communication, but just happen in a virtual space, in a online space. So we got to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about the digital environment, right? The web and the wireless communications, they're more than just media. They're this global means of interaction, multimodal, mass self-communication. And so Castells writes in the Network Society for millions of internet users, and now we could say it's even more, online communities have become a fundamental dimension of everyday life. Online communities are part of a virtual world, but real virtuality. Notice that. We've got to stop using the language of virtual and real, like virtual is not real. It's virtual reality. It's real virtuality. So the interactions that are happening in there, the relationships that are happening there, the worship of Jesus that's happening there, it's real, right? But it's a real virtuality. And for emerging generations, it's one of their primary ways of communication and worship. So if we think of just for a minute, the size of this digital mission field, it's the largest mission field ever in the history of the world. There's just for instance, 96% of Americans shop online. Average American spends 5 hours a day on their smartphone. Millennials, 5.7, right? So people remember that whole network idea? People spending 5, 6, 7 hours a day on their devices. Facebook has over 2.4 billion active users. Virtual reality already has 1 billion active users. So these are massive mission fields. If you think of it like this, Facebook became the largest nation on the earth back in 2016. Just think about the magnitude of that. And the digital space is populated by the largest human population in the history of civilization. It's the biggest mission field ever. Now, the hyper-connected and globalized nature of all this, and part of why we now live in a pandemic world, is because that same connectivity, and now that we're in this global village, and we can travel across the planet in a matter of a day or a couple of days, wherever we want to be in the world, that also can send a virus, right? So we may see the virus emerge in Florida or India or China or wherever, just like we've just seen with Omicron, right? And we see, oh, it's over there, that distant country. The next day, it's in our school, in our neighborhood, and then we're infected with it, right? So that's this reality of a globalized network society. But it also creates, in a damaging way, this concept called deterritorialization. Deterritorialization. And that's the disconnection between people's culture and place. And that is a bad thing that we as digital missionaries have to think about, that we not lose connection to our place. As Rosario and I write in the book, we have to have both feet firmly planted in the analog world if we're going to be digital missionaries. And we have to take times of Sabbath out of the digital space and off our screens and all of those things. And we'll explore some of that later. But if you think about the web as this one massive global city where we can encounter netizens from anywhere in the world, very normally our virtual reality church, we have people from Britain, we have people from Australia and Africa, we have people of different religions coming to stop in and have conversations about Jesus. So it's this massive like global ecosystem, but we can participate in that and be missionaries in that without losing our sense of placefulness, the physical location where our molecules gather and swap, molecules in an on-site kind of way. And places are not just merely placeholders; they're living, breathing ecosystems. They're webs of relationships. Every place has its own flowers, birds, insects, water sources, temperature. And so we need to know our place, love our place. We can't just bail and just live our whole life online. We have to live in this blended ecology and this balance of both and we'll get more into that and how Jesus taught his disciples to do that. So these flows of mobile and networked culture, we connect in first, second, and third places around practices. We have these new Christian communities and tattoo parlors and dog parks and burrito joints and yoga studios and then lots of online spaces as well. In a network society, in a digital age, people connect around practices. So I might not know my neighbor, but I got a group of friends and we go run 5Ks together, or we meet at the local burrito shop that we love to kick it after work, or we get together and we practice yoga, whatever. Those practices are the social connection points. And desperation is the seedbed of innovation. So as challenging as it's been trying to navigate ministry in a pandemic, it's also been this wonderful thrust forward into the future to really embrace digitality and sharing the gospel. And maybe we find ourselves on a new missional frontier. And I just believe that Jesus and Jesus' lordship and the presence of the Holy Spirit is not confined to some physical space only, but that Jesus is at work in this new missional frontier and in these digital spaces. Now, as we go into this, we need to understand that there's some things that happen with the brain that our digital technologies reshape our brains. And so we're either a digital native or digital immigrant. And depending on that, we experience technology in different ways, right? So if we're a digital native, we're born with a screen, we're born with a tech device in our hand, and we're going to have a different experience as somebody who's a digital immigrant, who's trying to learn digital technologies, who didn't grow up in a Zoom room or with the screen in their hand, right? And these generational things, people experience these technologies, generationally speaking, in different ways. So, Gen X, they're typified by high education levels, but they're still digital immigrants. Like technology was kind of coming into play, but weren't born with like a screen in the crib, right? Generation Y, the net gen, the digital natives, they grew up using computers. And Gen Z, they're digital natives at birth, right? I see toddlers all the time. My grandson has a tablet and he's on it and he can do all kinds of things with technology. I'm like, hey, can you help me with this? You know, he's 3 years old, right? So there's differences with technology. But she also shows that digital natives actually acquire information differently, using the distinction of icon versus text. So in a Gutenberg galaxy, we read text, lines of text left to right. Our brains are wired to think that way. In a digital ecosystem, we think iconographically. So we click an icon, the symbol opens a portal, right? We think in images and pictures and metaphors. And so we're shifting out, and our brain is going through this process of transformation from a Gutenberg text world to an icon world. And just think about the level, like our churches are set up for the Gutenberg world, like lines of pews with a preacher up on the front delivering the monologue, usually that they read, right? And now we're in this iconographic, digital, immersive kind of culture. So those who grew up accessing information in the Gutenberg age, our brains were wired for that, right? And to think in that way. And now that we're learning to interpret iconic symbols, we have to think about how we communicate the gospel, how we gather in community, how we form relationships in this new kind of system. Another person that I just encourage you to get to know is Marshall McLuhan, who was a Canadian kind of really a forerunner in digital ecology. And he said the medium is the message, that the medium is not neutral. The technologies we use are not neutral. They reshape our brains. It doesn't mean that they're good or they're bad, but it means that the tools that we use change us, and that the medium becomes an extension of ourselves. And neuroscientists are showing how engagement with digital technology is actually rewiring our brain. And so McLuhan was the father of media ecology, the study of the information environment. He said that the medium shaped and controlled the scale and form of human association and action. He was the first to advocate that a communication medium itself, not the message it carries, should be the focus of study. So we not just study the message, but the delivery system. And he showed that a technology widely used in society changed the content and the characteristics of that society. And we're seeing that happen before our eyes with digital technology. And the effects of technology go deep. Our sensation and our perception at a neurochemical level are even changed and altered. And in some ways, all of this brings us back to a culture of orality. That digital culture, while the Gutenberg culture is more a written text kind of culture, oral tradition is more of what happens in the digital age with the digital space. So if you think about, anthropologists have studied indigenous communities that have rich storytelling cultures and traditions and iconography and symbolism and all of those things. They study different groups of people, and oral tradition gets formalized and solidified in memory over generations, right? In a world of textual documents, like I grab a book and I read it, and that. So oral cultures pass down story and think iconographically and learn to just memorize these large quantities of information. And both oral and digital technologies foster this co-creative, participatory, and ever-emerging experiences that are deeply embedded in memories and new experiences brought together to create cultural coherence. So there's good in all of this, right? And if we think about how the Hebrews carried their stories and their traditions and memorized the entirety of the scriptures, right, by the age of 13. And so their oral culture that were, carrying this information, the stories of their faith. And there's a return to that in digitality. And early Christians were deeply formed in the culture of both oral transmission and technology. So when Christianity comes on the scene, documents are becoming available in the codex, and we're using the Roman road system, the publicus cursus, to deliver letters, and Paul's using that Roman road system. The Gospels are carried down orally for a period of time, but then they get written down as we have them today, right? And Christianity evolves into this religion of the written word, but utilizing those technologies. So I'll close this first lecture with just reminding us that Christians have always led the way in harnessing these emerging technologies. So just think about Paul used those technologies to communicate through the first scattered churches. He was doing his own form of distance contact, right? I'm writing to these letters to you. I long to be with you, but I'm communicating. And some of the earliest documents that we have in the Christian church are Paul's letters, right? Of his use of a technology. There was an emerging technology. Then Christians used the codex, thankfully, right? Because now we have Bibles, right? Johannes Gutenberg, the printing press, fueled the Reformation, fueled this missional movement to make Christianity a movement of the common people. And Billy Graham, for instance, used stadiums, microphones, speakers in his evangelism crusades and translated into the first birthing of modern megachurches. So we see Christians using these technologies. And the final thing, as we move into the semester together, I just want to share this quote from you. It's actually in the preface of Vincent Donovan's Christianity Rediscovered. And I thought it's a fitting way to enter into the semester together when he says, and Vincent Donovan was a missionary to the Maasai people, and he went trying to be a missionary in the Euro-tribal, like white colonial way of being a missionary, realized it was all wrong, and that he had to be one with the Maasai people, learn from them, ask them who God was to them, and create Christian communities that were contextually appropriate for them. And I love this line in the preface to the book. Do not try to call them back to where they were, and do not try to call them to where you are, beautiful as that place may seem to you. You must have the courage to go with them to a place where neither you nor they have been before. As we enter into this adventure into the digital age, I just want to invite us to have the courage to maybe do some unlearning kind of the mental models that we bring to this, and to enter into the space with soft eyes, the eyes of a learner, and to have the courage to go to a place where Jesus is leading us that maybe we've never been before. And that's okay, because we trust in God and we trust in the Holy Spirit that God's going to be with us as we go into the digital frontier in a digital age. So thank you for tuning in this first lecture. By the way, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. I post all my lectures there if you want to keep up to date with those. I welcome you to do that. And so thank you. This was lecture 1.